Milbre Burch. Milbre is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina right now. She just finished helping to make a storytelling festival happen over in Chapel Hill, and that I heard was received quite well. You can find out more information at her website, kindcrone.com. She has CDs available. The biggest thing I've learned about Milbre, besides the physicality of her body as she tells stories, is just that when she speaks and says something to you, just do it because it's most likely right. And that she will help you tell better stories. She loves stories where they come from and how they help people. She investigates and researches them. And when she brings them to us, we know that the work has been done. And so we wait anxiously to hear Milbre share with us again a new one, Abe Zaccheus.
Thank you so much. In fact, this is not a new story. It is a retelling of a New Testament story from Luke about a character named Zacchaeus. I have set the story in modern day Georgia, which is my birth state, and I was commissioned to write this story by All Saints Church in Pasadena, California, many years ago when I was living there. So it's a pleasure to bring an old story told a new way to another audience. And Sheila, many thanks for all that you do to make stories happen and storytellers come together with story listeners. Thank you. I grew up in Jericho, a little town outside Atlanta. And even as a child, I was fascinated by the people around me, especially one man named Abe Zaccheus. Now, things were already changing in my town when Abe came. Atlanta was experiencing growing pains. And in our community, it seemed as though we went to sleep one night out in the country and woke up the next morning in a suburb. Folks weren't sure what to make of it. Folks weren't sure what to make of Abe Zaccheus either. He arrived the summer I was 8. A short, wiry little guy who came to town to work as the local dog catcher. He was replacing old man Evans, who retired after 40 years of looking the other way when your dog got loose. If old man Evans recognized your dog, which he almost certainly did, he'd load him up in the dog catching truck and drive him home to you. The owner would usually give him a cup of coffee and a piece of pie, or maybe a big sack of tomatoes, or sometimes they'd tip him with cash money. That's what folks was used to. Now, the problem was Abe Zaccheus took his dog catching job seriously, and he was good at it. Now, nobody in our town obeyed the leash laws. Everybody let their dogs run free, which meant there was a constant supply of new dogs to get loose. And Abe Zaccheus, he'd round up those free roaming varmints and take them to the pound. You had to go downtown and pay a fine to get your dog back, whether it was your prize hunting dog or a no-count mutt. There were no exceptions. Now, some folks had so many dogs or were so ticked at Abe that they just leave the dogs he collected in the pound till they were adopted by somebody else or something worse. They couldn't figure out if you wanted to get along with your neighbors or you like dogs, why you do such a good job of dog catching. Folks didn't know much about Abe and they didn't try to find out either. But on Saturdays at the barbershop, they told stories about him. Now, the stories were complete conjecture, and they always played Abe as the villain or the buffoon. I was too young to care one way or another where I got my hair cut, so I just go along with my brothers. And do you know, it took about an hour to cut all three of us. And sooner or later, the conversation always turned to Abe Zaccheus. I remember one man said that he must have been a jockey in Kentucky till he threw a race and they chased him out of town clear down to Georgia. And another man said that Abe was such a runt because he was the last child in a large family And by the time he come along, his mama had plumb run dry. And everybody laughed. But it made me feel kind of sorry for him. I guess in my child's heart, I became Abe's champion. You see, after they paved our road, we had 3 dogs to be run down. So my mama said we couldn't have no more dogs unless we kept them tied up at home. And the other thing was, I was little too, the runt in my family. Both my brothers were big. My papa was over 6 feet. Even my mama was 5'10". Being a girl coming after 2 big boys, I had to learn to hold my ground. My mama said, you make up in mule-headedness what you don't have in size. And that was true. There wasn't anybody in town who liked Abe Zaccheus except me. And all I did is just wave at him when I saw him drive his dog catching truck by. Summer is revival time in my town. And one August, the mayor had arranged for a celebrated evangelist, the Reverend Joe Henry Hudson, to come to our town to preach a revival. Now, on that day, people closed their shops early or kept them closed all day long, and they lined the streets with blankets and lounge chairs like it was the 4th of July. There was a bandstand at the end of the road, and there the mayor and the pastors of the Presbyterian and the Baptist and the Methodist churches all lined up there to greet the famous Dr. Hudson. And behind them on the lawn, the ladies of the church had set up a lunch concession. I went along with my mama to deliver our 3 trays of pigs in a blanket, and then we went to look for my papa and my brothers along the parade route. Well, we found them at last, about a block from the bandstand, but they were standing back under the trees that lined the street. There were still people in front of us standing, as well as the ones in their lounge chairs. And I kept pestering my papa to hold me up so I could see, but he had a bad back, and little as I was, he couldn't hold me in the air for long. Now, after a moment, the crowd began to rustle and speak out, and that meant that the Reverend Hudson had arrived. Look, Will, said my mama to my daddy, he's going to get out his car and walk down the street. Well, now I'll never get to see him, I said. I knew I was whining, but I felt justified in spreading my displeasure. And right at that moment, we heard a voice behind us that said, there's room for another one up here. Why don't you lift up the little gal so she can see? And we turned and looked, and there was Abe Zaccheus, the dog catcher, sitting in the lower branches of a live oak tree. Well, Mama and Papa smiled, and together they lifted me up and sat me down next to him on the branch. And I could see real good from there. I even saw people across the street were elbowing each other and pointing in our direction. And I heard one woman next to my mama suck in her breath and say, I don't know what Abe Zaccheus is doing here. I never saw him in church. But I didn't let that bother me none. I was in heaven, declaring my alliance with the dog catcher in public and getting a bird's eye view of the famous Dr. Hudson. Well, I could hardly sit still. I kept rearranging my seat on the branch, and it might have been my bobbin on the branch that caught his attention. But Dr. Hudson, he stopped as soon as he got to where we were, looked up, laughed, and called out a greeting. I looked at Abe, and he looked at me, and he said hello back from us. And then Dr. Hudson called us down from that tree and told us to come walk with him on the parade route. I know my mouth dropped open because my brothers told me later I looked like a bullfrog about to have lunch. Well, my parents nodded, and so we jumped down out of the tree, but still there was folks standing between us and the road. Even though Abe was a grown-up, the two of us both had to be lifted up and over those folks till we could stand in the street. When I landed, I turned and looked back, and I saw Abe Zaccheus being held aloft by folks who wouldn't even shake his hand. When he landed, he was smiling too. We stepped in on either side of Pastor Hudson and walked down that last block, and I was just waving at everybody. The crowd had gotten real quiet since we'd gotten there into the parade. And then we reached the bandstand, and the mayor and the pastors all shook our hands one at a time, like they do at a graveside funeral. And then they ushered us over to the lunch concession so we could load up our plates. And then we went and sat at a stone picnic table to share our meal. I could see there were folks looking at us between their bites of food. And Dr. Hudson, he noticed that too. And it made him look at Abe Zaccheus with a face full of curiosity. Well, I had just finished my second pig in a blanket when my parents walked up with my brothers. And that's when Dr. Hudson invited my whole family to go out with him to Abe Zaccheus' house. He said he'd carry us out there himself and that he'd bring us back in time for supper before the revival. I didn't dare look at my parents for fear they'd say no, but they agreed. I couldn't believe the way this day was turning out, but the biggest surprise was yet to come. Now, Abe lived in a house on the highway heading out of town, and when we pulled into his driveway, we were greeted by a choir of barking dogs. My brothers and I, we got out and we ran around the back of the house to see what was what. And we saw a long range of about 15 kennels there. It looked as though Abe Zaccheus had adopted every abandoned dog in the county. In fact, half of his carport was filled with bags of dog chow big as me. My papa said later that he figured Abe spent half his paycheck every week just to keep those dogs fed. And such a convention of tail waggers you ever saw. There was waggling puppies of every breed, and just grown dogs and old hounds. There were 2 mutts that were recovering from buckshot in their hindquarters, and 1 3-legged German shepherd. Now, Abe walked along the runs he'd built so the dogs could get exercise while he was at work, and pointed out each dog and told me the name he knew it had and what he knew about their life story. Then he told me and my brothers which of those runs we could go inside of to play with the dogs while the grown-ups went inside to talk. About 4 o'clock that afternoon, the door opened and Abe stepped out just smiling, and the preacher followed him, clearly finishing the conversation that had begun in the house. He put his hand on Abe's shoulder and he said, "This day is salvation come to this house." And then the 2 of them shook hands. Well, my parents rode back to town with Pastor Hudson, but Abe Zaccheus loaded me and my brothers up in the dog catching truck, and he drove us back to town. The whole way there, my brothers just kept talking with Abe about how to design and build kennels for the 3 dogs that had adopted us that day. But me, I just kept quiet and still, thinking to myself, next time I go to the barber shop, I'm going to have me a story to tell.
Oh my goodness, what a extraordinary adaptation of that story of Zacchaeus. Milbre, my mind is soaring with how you put that together. And then the perspective of that little girl, not once did you stop. Not once was that unbelievable. You were absolutely her in every way. But the essence of that story, in my faith tradition, we say, "Amen, preacher girl." And so that's all I can say. Amen, preacher girl. Oh my goodness. Ladies and gentlemen, Milbre Burch. Wow. Wow.